the marginalization or the destruction of the African Guyanese community. I do not believe that they can succeed in destroying the African Guyanese community. But I do believe they have done a good job of creating dependence, of marginalizing, and creating a sense of hopelessness, which we need to rectify. It is in this context I would like to make my contribution to these discussions. I have with groups work out solutions, but I thought the best thing to do here is to attempt to bring elements of the political economy of domination and control into the debate so that we can address it and hopefully come up with solutions. In closing, I want to wish you the best for today and going forward. I did ask to leave. I did indicate that I was going to be coming from Dartmouth to here and then on to Linden. But I wanted to honor the invitation. And so with those words, I think I would have. I want to wish you all the best and to say to you, I am disposed to being involved in discussions on the African Guyanese community. And I want to say to the entire world, which I said in Buxton, representation of the African community doesn't make you a racist. Every community has the right to analyze its own situation and to come up with its own proposals. And I urge you not to worry when you are described as racist. You are not here to dominate any other ethnic group. We are here to discuss, analyze, and understand our domination and to expose it to the world and take actions to deal with it. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Aubrey. Thank you very much. The evolution of our community has meant that we've had to always throw up representatives with broad praxis. My students always ask me, why an African chemistry teacher will talk about John Coltrane in his chemistry class, or the historian talking about dance and cinema. And I often have to tell them that it is the nature of this society itself, that if you're coming up against a totalitarian system as enslavement and colonialism and domination, that you yourself in meeting the demands of pushing back against that system, you have to develop your own broad praxis. And so it is in that context that we invite our keynote speaker today, who is a lawyer by profession, but a warrior for social justice, one who brings together the law and economics and politics and popular music all together in the practice of his representation of our community. And representation is the key here. I remember a few weeks ago, some women went in front of his office to voice some concerns. And he came out from his office and engaged in a discussion with them. And I remember Sister Simona Broom said, "Use be liar. We ain't care with nobody." He said, "Use be liar." But I want to invite to the podium now to give our keynote address to the real liar, Mr. Nigel Hughes. Brother, thank you, thank you.
Brothers and sisters, good afternoon. I want to take the opportunity to, as always, pay tribute and sacrifice to those that have suffered before us, those that have given their lives, and those that gave more than they had to allow us to be where we are today. Our ancestors deserve the highest possible accolades that we could possibly pay to them. I want also to salute today the efforts of those who are with us that continue the struggle in the most difficult of circumstances to ensure that never again do we return to that era where we were exploited. And I think it is important that we say thank you to them in their presence. I want to salute Dr. David Hines for his consistent struggle and battles on behalf of not only the African people, but on behalf of Guyanese for creating a better Guyana. I want particularly to recognize and celebrate Vincent Alexander, leader, intellectual, consistent for what he continues to do for our community and for continuing to keep the message, whatever your views are in Mr. Burnham, for continuing to keep the message about independent thought, the future, and to plan always for the next day through the Burnham Foundation. Vincent. It is important that when we have the warriors from the past who are still with us, who can share their experiences of what it is that they went through in the past, but not so much what they went through in the past, but the circumstances that led them to do the things that they had to do in the past to ensure that we today can enjoy the benefits we have. Hamilton Green, former Prime Minister, I respect you. I think, and I say this in my personal experience, and I share it whenever I get the opportunity. I went to one of those, what you would probably call capitalist secondary schools, where the more privileged went to St. Stanislaus College. And it was amazing the impact, the propaganda that was not only hostile to Burnham, but that was personal to people like Mr. Green. It created an impact and an image and demonized these people. And it was only until several of us who went to that institution were afforded the opportunity not only of tertiary education, but of a different experience in Ghana, did we come to appreciate what was actually being done for our benefit that we did not see at the time. So I salute Vincent, Mr. Green, David, and I also want to salute those that didn't make it, those that were in the forefront, particularly the women of change in education. And I only mentioned this briefly before I come to what I really want to say today. Because education, and the leader of the opposition, Mr. Norton, mentioned it. But he mentioned it tangentially in terms of the consequence in 1992 of the reintroduction of fees for education. One of the greatest, for me, in my assessment, positive developments that impacted the African community and all communities in Guyana and reversed the vilest form of prejudice that existed was the introduction of free education in 1974. Every time I speak to a young lawyer and they don't understand that the privilege they have of being where they are started as a result of what happened in 74, because otherwise, had they been born into those circumstances now, they would not see the doors of a university. And so I want us to remember, particularly those of us who are of advanced age, that the young people haven't lost history. They are unaware of their own history and the sacrifices that have been done to allow them to reach their position where they take it for granted that education is a right, which it should be, but the sacrifices that went there that were made by our predecessors to allow them to get there. That's enough for my rant this afternoon. Forgive my poor manners. I want also to thank Cuffy 250. Because last year when they were vilified for talking about an emerging, they never said we had reached the stage of apartheid, because there are too many warriors in our history to ever allow an apartheid state to come into existence in Guyana without a war. But they sounded the warning, and the statistics that I will come to will support it, about what was emerging. And therefore, it was a cry for us all to open our eyes to what is happening. We have been asleep for a long time. I come now to Article 15 of the Constitution of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. Our Constitution. It says this: the goal of economic development includes the objective of laying the material basis for the greatest possible satisfaction of the people's growing material, cultural, and intellectual requirements, as well as the dynamically stable development of their personality, creativity, thank you so much, entrepreneurial skills, and cooperative relations in a plural society. And it ends with what I want to make as part of the theme of my suggestion today. It says, the state shall intervene to mitigate any deleterious effects of competition on individuals or groups of individuals. And I emphasize that because there's a view that in a free market, open society, if it is that you're exploited and that you are marginalized and that you are made irrelevant, the state has no role. Our Constitution says not that the state may, the state shall intervene to mitigate any deleterious effects of competition on individuals and groups of individuals. A year ago, when Cuffy 250 hosted the conference under the theme, Resisting the Emerging Apartheid State, there were vociferous noises emanating from pretty prominent government and government-aligned quarters asking for the evidence and why haven't reports been made to international bodies in support of this proposition. Remember, that was the cry a year ago. Research was conducted and many instances continued on the issues of the biased allocation and distribution of resources. About a year ago, a presentation entitled Economy and Justice presented evidence that disclosed the allocation of some of the major economic resources of the Republic, including the following. Give me. 1 of every 6 gold export licenses that was allocated by the state was allocated to a person of African descent. 1 of 6. That means 5 of the 6 went elsewhere, and we know where elsewhere is. It disclosed that 100% of the contracts for the procurement of drugs was allocated to persons who were not of African descent, 100%. It also disclosed that not one single offshore block was allocated to any person of African descent. Just think about it. The future of this country for the next 25 years will depend on the production of oil. And not a single offshore block went to a person of African descent or an entity that could be described as controlled by persons of African descent. Only 9% of the stone quarry licenses were issued to persons of African descent. None of the shore bases or prospective shore bases was owned or was intended to be owned and operated by persons of African descent. In excess of 90% of the contracts for water treatment plants and supplies were issued to persons of a single ethnic group which were not African, and only 17% of the Ministry of Housing's contracts for road construction were awarded to persons of African descent. And that came out in that publication. The response of the government did not challenge the accuracy of the data, but they said that they were historic explanations for the disparity, and the vice president even said that there were categories in which African Guyanese did not even bid. That was the official response from the government. The evidence disclosed by this data would have signaled that there was a complete imbalance in the distribution of the state's resources, in the award of contracts, which was not only not defensible, but that the collection of data on the distribution of resources was vital and necessary. And you would have expected that policies would have been put in place to rebalance what was obviously a great imbalance in the distribution of the country's resources. Because that's what you expect. If you say this is an accident of history, but it does disclose an imbalance, you'd have to start putting in place policies that would redress that imbalance so that you begin to rebalance what is clearly an injustice. 1 year later, excuse me, and there has been no announcement which acknowledges that the distribution of the state resources was lopsided, and certainly no announcements of the implementation of any policy which would bring and address the imbalances of the distribution of the state's resources. Perhaps of even greater importance is that after the publication of the data, which demonstrated the importance of the collection of disaggregated data, and it's important to understand the difference between disaggregated data and aggregated data. I can come to you and say, 10 people died of prostate cancer last year, and there are 5 ethnic groups, and the average is 2 persons per ethnic group would have died from prostate cancer. Disaggregated data may show that 8 of the 10 persons who died from prostate cancer came from the African community, and therefore 8 out of 10, which is 80%, when the aggregated average is only 1/5, 20%, in the absence of knowing that 80% of the people in the African community died from prostate cancer, you may run around thinking that prostate cancer is an equal opportunity disease. And that is precisely why disaggregated data in a multi-ethnic community is crucial. As a matter of fact, as I go on, my proposition is we must elevate it to inclusion in the Constitution, because you cannot, in a multi-ethnic society, discuss the impact of policy, health, or any aspect of your life if it is not disaggregated, because otherwise you will get a completely false picture. Perhaps it is a long and well-established scientific fact that disaggregated data can reveal deprivations and inequalities that may not be fully reflected in aggregated data. We must recognize that meaningful disaggregation of data by race and ethnicity is a crucial aspect of equity goals, which require government commitment. We must allocate sustained spending to historically excluded populations and groups so that they're included in that disaggregated data. We must engage all communities, particularly the African communities, as partners in defining data questions, collection, and utilization. This would particularly help the indigenous community, because then the disparity between the spending on one community as compared to theirs would become particularly evident. We must undertake to educate community members about the importance of data and fostering trust in the collection of data and the research community. We must collect, analyze, and report data from smaller and marginalized communities in ways that protect confidentiality, minimize risk, and avoid perpetuating stereotypes. Excuse me. Perhaps most importantly, we must advocate and demand policy changes as a result of the data disclosed by the research. So, in the example I gave before, if 8 out of 10 persons that die from prostate cancer come from the African community, then there needs to be more resources allocated to the African community to deal with prostate cancer. So it's not only the collection of the data, is that you must then, at the level of the state, adopt policies to address the inequities that have been disclosed as a result of the data. We must promote accountability mechanisms for entities that fail to adhere to existing minimum standards for disaggregated data collection. There is a lot of aggregated data being published recently. The most recent publication was on Friday, where the local content secretariat said that $333 million had been spent on local companies as a result of local content policies under the Act. Thank you so much, sir. You may think that's fantastic. $333 million have come into the Guyanese economy as a result of local content policies. But unless you disaggregate that 333 million, you will never find out how much of that money came into the African community. Because it may well be that only $300 million, that only $30 million came into the African community, while the 300 went elsewhere. Because you can't look at the numbers of companies that have been granted local content certificates, because the certificate doesn't give you the contract, just makes you eligible. And quite often, they give you certificates in areas that will never be relevant to oil and gas. But they will tell you, we have issued 400 certificates. If 300 of those certificates are for people selling soft drinks at the side of the road, it's not relevant to oil and gas. So we need the disaggregated data to understand the full effect and impact of where that $333 million was spent. Permit me to quote from our own Professor Terence Blackman, who is a proponent of this disaggregated data. He said, and I quote, "Disaggregating data is not a mere technical endeavor, but a critical step in dismantling systemic racism. By committing to data equity and ensuring that all communities are represented and visible in data, we can shift research, policies, narratives, and impact towards equity. So we begin to do the heavy lifting in equity, in equality. In a modern, multi-ethnic, multi-race society, disaggregated data should be elevated to a constitutional right. Article 15 of the Constitution, which I referred to earlier, said that the state must intervene to mitigate the deleterious effects of competition in groups. The data disclosed in the publication of Economy and Justice, which was not challenged, mandates the state to intervene immediately to address the deleterious effect of competition in the African Guyanese community. So an example would be if only 19% of the quarry licenses are given to the African community, the state must immediately intervene, not wait for the next election or wait for the next sitting of the National Assembly. It must immediately intervene to ensure that more quarry licenses are issued to the African Guyanese community. Similarly, with gold export licenses, we're only 1 out of 6. And I know of at least 3 African Guyanese who've been applying for these licenses. But where only 1 out of 6 has been issued to the African Guyanese community, the state must intervene immediately to ensure that there's equity in the granting of those licenses by expanding the number of persons who are granted licenses to include persons from the African community who clearly have the capacity. This must be a demand, and it must require immediate action. There are 3 other areas of equal importance that I seek your indulgence to address briefly. They are the economics of our community, the constitutional architecture of this republic, excuse me, in an era of oil and gas, and our educational crisis. I think one can safely say that the current constitutional architecture in this country has either outlived its usefulness or is incapable of delivering any benefit to the citizens of this country in an equitable manner. The National Assembly has confirmed that it serves little purpose other than to rubber stamp the directives of the executive in the most toxic of circumstances. It rarely meets, and its subcommittees are of equal value. In an electorally divided society, which is reflective of our ethnic fault lines, the leadership of respective communities never meet, while the toxicity which exists between the communities increases daily. And you don't have to look very far into history where rival communities don't meet to find out what the consequences are. The transfer of all the executive power under the Constitution to the winner in a hopelessly divided society has been and continues to be most counterproductive. We should perhaps look at the historic data. There has never, ever been an era of unity in Guyana since independence, probably even before. And that's a fact. It's not a criticism of any previous leader. It is a fact of life. Our previous leaders have always been committed to the idea of unity. But the fact is, we have never had unity. We don't need to lament it, and I'm not asking anyone to explain it. What I'm asking is that we take it as a fact, just as how the sun will rise tomorrow in the east, we take it as a fact that we are not united, and we have never been united. And I want to proffer that the prospect of unity in the near future and in the medium future is a very, very dim prospect. So we're now waiting for Moses. We're in 2023. Let's accept there has been no unity and the prospect of unity does not exist. It's not the end of the world. What do you do with that information? We should accept this fact as the foundation to create what might be reasonably possible. So let's accept the fact that we don't see things the same way. we are not unified. If we start from the premise that trust has never been present, and the Vice President loves to say that all the time, trust must exist. It doesn't have to exist. In many places in the world, when often you go into business contracts, you don't go into business contract based on trust. You're going into it with your eyes open. And it's because you expect mistrust that you seek to protect yourselves in the provisions in the contract. So if we start from the premise that trust has never been present and is unlikely to be present in the short and medium term, then let's start to begin to construct a constitution which is not premised on trust. It should perhaps start with the principles of the rule of law, equality, equity, and justice as the systems which underpin the Constitution. Where trust is not a prerequisite, then constitutional arrangements should not be premised on the assumption that the government of the day will be capable of governing for all without having to satisfy some inbuilt connotation arrangements that it must secure in the majority of the views of the majority of the stakeholders. The concept of simple majority must be replaced by the requirements of supermajorities, so at least we ensure that most voices are heard before major decisions are undertaken and executed. The incentive under these new arrangements would be to achieve consensus and not what currently operates under the guise of democracy. If we have learned anything about our constitutional democracy, is you can be elected to discriminate as a legitimate consequence of an election every 5 years. So if I elect you, you somehow become empowered to discriminate against me merely because you have got elected once every 5 years. The term of office in a multi-society, multi-ethnic society like ours, where distrust or mistrust is abundant, should not have a term of 5 years. It should be 4 years. 5 years is too long a time for seething injustices, real or perceived, to be allowed to fester. National Assembly subcommittees should operate on the principle of supermajorities. Local government systems, which require an entirely separate consideration and discussion, and we don't have the time for it today, but if I were to recommend, I would certainly say Mr. Alexander has done work that is unparalleled in this relation. I come now to the African economic existence. On the anniversary of the 1823 uprising, it is perhaps appropriate to reflect upon the lessons of the post-emancipation economic systems imposed and the parallels with that system and the systems that are deployed today in Guyana. In the post-emancipation British Guyana, the colonial government determined that licenses should be issued only to Portuguese people. That is how the Portuguese people became the merchants. It wasn't by virtue of any greater skill. It was by virtue of the system that controlled the licensing and the permits. And after the Portuguese had been brought here as indentured, and that experiment failed, the British government issued licenses only to them, and they created the basis for the Portuguese wealth and the fact that the African people would always be the buyers. Because in the African communities, the only persons who were allowed to sell to them were the Portuguese under permits and licenses. If we fast forward to contemporary Guyana, we just have to ask ourselves, who issues the gold export licenses? Who issues the quarry licenses? Who issues the contracts? Who issues the contracts for pharmaceutical and drug procurement contracts? Who issues the contracts for offshore blocks and shore bases? It comes back to the use of state power and permitting to allow the development of only those persons that the state determines should progress. Is there any African business entity which is in the top 50 enterprises in Guyana? It's a question. I don't have the answer. And if they are, how many? Pick your area of economic activity: banking, insurance, oil and gas, construction, forestry resources, health procurement, rice. The leader of the opposition just told you what happened in rice, and the list goes on. None of these has any significant African presence. The young entrepreneurs who are struggling to get their oil and gas businesses off the ground have to contend with high interest rates, financial institutions which require land as collateral, and if and when they get past these hurdles, they're defeated on the basis that they lack experience. Whether this is by historic accident or not, it cannot persist. The policies to redress this imbalance must be implemented without delay. The redress that has to accompany this effort must provide financing, training, technical support, and amendments to the Financial Institutions Act to provide unsecured or creatively collateralized securities to the appropriate qualified African entrepreneurs. The current system by which contracts and opportunities which are made available to the African business community come with the requirement that either you must support the PPP or at a minimum, you must be completely silent against the PPP. This will have to go. History has always judged silence and complicity harshly in these times of moral consequence. Finally, education in an oil and gas society. And this perhaps is the most frightening insofar as what the statistics show. Modern oil and gas economy will require skilled labor force, of which the minimum level of qualification will be secondary education. Permit me to quote from an article by my brother Terence Campbell, and he was referring to published statistics. He says, of the 14 territories surveyed by CARICOM, the regional integration movement, Guyana has the lowest secondary survival rate with a score of 41%. That is the aggravated data on Guyana. 40%, 41% of our students across the board complete secondary education. The quote continues. The Ministry of Education, in its Education Sector Plan 2021 to 2025, which were based on 2017 statistics, highlighted a secondary school dropout rate of 50%. 50% of our students were dropping out of secondary school, and we were already in an oil economy. The ministry pointed out, and this is a quote from the ministry, this is the Ministry of Education, more than 50% of Guyanese working age population has primary school education or less. I would be very interested if we disaggregate that data to find out in the African community what percentage of us actually have primary school education or less. The Stabrook News, in a review of the 2012 consensus, confirmed that the African Guyanese population comprised nearly 1/2 of the total population in Region 10 at 49%, 40.6% of Region 4, 33.1% of Region 5, and lesser proportions in relation to the other regions. The dropout rates, respectively, for those three regions are 44% for Linden, 44% for Region 5, and 46% in Region 3. That is published data. The current economic condition of African Guyanese is likely to be highly correlated to the deficit in education. So the less education we have is the less prospects for any sort of economic advancement. I said this in a program with David, and I didn't intend it to be alarmist, but I just want to say to you that in a modern, fancy Guyana, with Ferraris and other fancy cars here, gated communities, fantastic restaurants, snazzy lights, bright highways, and every time you turn on the TV, you're seeing signs of progress. If you are young, male, urban, you don't have to be urban, and African, and you don't make it past secondary school, what is your option? You only have one option, because you are not going to sit down and watch the Ferraris and the Maseratis and the other cars drive up and down, walk through your neighborhood, pick up all the pretty girls, eat in fancy places, and everything will tell you that you are worthless. And the only sense that you will perceive and the only avenue that will be available to you to give you anything looking like respect is an AR-15 or an AK-47. And that is not a voluntary choice. That is an inevitable choice, because if you're going to participate, or if you want to participate in the wealth and you're not getting it legitimately, you are going to take it illegitimately. So we are condemning our young male Africans in particular who do not finish secondary school. And right now, the statistics say they're 50% to crime. We don't have to go further than Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago to understand that once, and I see Mr. Conway here, once you head down the street of armed robberies and gated communities and kidnapping, you don't have a moment where you suddenly find Jesus and turn around. It never happens. We can speak to our Jamaican sisters and brothers. They have tried everything under every administration. GLP, PNP, and they have not been able to address crime to the extent that we saw that the Prime Minister of Jamaica, who was the Prime Minister for Tivoli Gardens, which was controlled by Dudas, the Prime Minister was actually controlled by Dudas. He could not send any law enforcement agency to arrest him unless Uncle Sam demanded it. And as a consequence, what happened? The Prime Minister of Jamaica had to resign because the warlord for Tivoli Gardens, had to be extradited. Now, Jamaica might have seemed like a distant prospect to us before oil and gas. It is coming to us like tomorrow is coming to us. And if we don't address this now, particularly on the educational front, we are going to be in perpetual crisis. Now, nobody escapes this crisis. This is not going to be only a crisis for the African community. Everybody will be affected by this. And so I want to recommend that fully funded policies and efforts for African Guyanese should be implemented as follows. Financial support to ensure the mandatory attendance at school. The implementation of relevant TVET and TVOT programs. Implementation of remedial education programs at the primary and secondary levels, because we have to salvage those that have already fallen off the path. Implementation of large-scale adult remedial education programs, because even if we might not have had the opportunity to be able to take advantage of the future, we have to be able to have the skills. And so those are my recommendations. But I am aware that my good friends at Cuffy 250 said, today the subject is the state of African Guyanese in a one-sided one Guyana. But I think we missed the memo. It's not one Guyana. The government position is we own Guyana, and they don't include us. Their policy is not one Ghana, it's that they and their supporters own the country. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brother Nigel. Please give him another round of applause. What we're going to do now is we're going to have a panel of presenters, and I invite them to come on stage now. Mr. Vincent Alexander, Mr. Kimani Nehusi, Sister Dawn Holder, Mr. Paul Slow, is Mr. Slow here? No, he's not. Oh, he's coming. Okay. Huh? Oh, he's on Zoom. Hello, Mr. Paul.
Hello, Doc.
Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. Each presenter will present. After each presentation, we'll take 1 or 2 questions. And I'll be looking at the time. If we're running out of time, we'll probably skip those questions. And then once the presenters are finished, we are going to open it up for a broader discussion. So please give the panelists a round of applause. And we'll start the ball rolling with Brother Kimani Nehusi, who will address the question of recognition. And this is one of the areas that has been identified by the United Nations in the international decade, the people of African descent. Brother Kimani Nehusi via Queenstown and Buxton, because he has citizenship of both villages. Brother Kimani.
Sisters and brothers, good afternoon. Good afternoon also to those who are looking and listening on Facebook, Zoom, and other spaces in cyberspace. I want to begin by thanking Cuffy 250 for putting on this occasion. And not just merely putting it on this time, but for persisting in carrying this on every year. Our ability to continue to do things on behalf of our community, and especially to institutionalize our responses to our environment, is a measure of our success. And I hope that one of the things I'm going to point out is that the system that oppresses us has specialized in trying to disrupt and erase our institutional development. And you've had examples of that from the leader of the opposition and from Brother Nigel, who spoke to us before. I want also to thank my fellow panelists for helping to make this occasion one that I am quite confident will continue, and this is in the light of the 2 previous presentations, to be informative and therefore to help to address the needs of our community. I've been asked to speak on the question of recognition. And what I'm hoping to do is to ask ourselves and answer the question, recognition of whom or what? And I venture to say that the answers to those two questions look at the fundamentals of ourselves. Those things without which no group of people can ever get near to becoming what they need to be, much less what they could be. And it is very important that as we ask ourselves this question, who are we? What are we? Where do we come from? How did we get here? And therefore, what's in our interest? What must we do? We have to begin by placing ourselves in the full and complete historical and cultural context of ourselves. Part of our problem is that we have been miseducated on many fronts. And we're going to come back to repeating questions on education, I'm certain. But who are we involves a response that addresses our history and our culture. The word is identity. We need not bother ourselves and go deeply into what identity is. I think we all know. It's something that's so fundamental, the concept of ourselves, that without it, we wouldn't know what our real interests are. Without identity, we will be like rudderless ships upon a stormy sea. Any breeze will take us where it wants us. Today we might be Catholic, tomorrow we're Adventist, next day we're Rasta, 2 days after we cut off our locks, we are, all over the place because we're rudderless. We don't have a center. That comes from not knowing who we are. How did we get here to Guyana? Where do we come from? Where did our people's story begin? Even to know the answer of those questions in a most elementary way, without going into the large details, is a huge help for us. But the system that oppresses us, and I hope to demonstrate this, has specialized in disrupting our story, of cutting us off from our history. So we don't know who we are. And because we don't know who we are, we do not know what our genuine interests are. And because we do not know what our genuine interests are, we cannot defend them and we cannot advance them. We're up a stream without a paddle. And our resurrection starts with the recognition of our condition and taking back ourselves, our minds. Now, let me say something else. Identity is not nationality. Identity is not nationality. Too many African Guyanese have been confused on this question. We believe in a nonsensical proposition that in order to be one people, one nation with one destiny, we cannot be African Guyanese or we cannot be African. We have to be some kind of nebulous thing And we've become very defensive on saying we're Africans. Well, to be African is to be your identity. It's not your nationality. Your nationality is Guyanese. And let's go a bit further and deeper. Anytime you mess with somebody's identity, you mess with them in a very fundamental way. And if you don't believe me, look at ourselves today. We're in a massive confusion. We're going backwards while other people are going forward. And big part of the problem, if they could fix one single thing about us, and you fixed our identity, the rest will correct itself. You could change your nationality. I could leave Guyana, as I did, go to another country, qualify for residence permit, get their passport. I'm a national of that country, United States, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, wherever. I could have 2 or 3 nationalities simultaneously. But the moment you begin to mess with my identity, this is fundamental. This is really serious. So anybody who is changing their identity or had their identities changed is in a real trouble, a real spot of bother. Because like I said before, your identity is what locates you in place and time. Your identity is what tells you what's right for you and what's wrong for you. Your identity tells you where you have been. Your identity tells you where you are. And your identity tells you where you need to go. There's an African wisdom saying that says, if you know the beginning well, the end will not trouble you. If you know the beginning well, the end will not trouble you. I'm a member of a department of Africology. Some say it's the leading department in the world in the study of African people. And we study African people from the points of view of African people. And two big principles we make is that you place the history, you place African people in our entire history and in our culture, if you really want to understand us, our behaviors. So let us ask ourselves this question. Again, who are we? We're an African people. How do we relate to history? Well, our history did not begin when Western Europeans brought some of our ancestors in chains to this country. Our history began when history began. Humanity was born in black skin and fizzy hair under a tropical sky in Africa. The first human beings were Africans. And it is African people who created human culture, the values that we call human or humanistic today. It is African people who created the first civilizations in the world. An African state, Kemet, ancient Egypt, led the world for over 3,000 years. What are the consequences of this for us, of knowing this? Why do most of us don't know this? These are important things for us, but I want to rush on and say this. What happened? African people were doing great things, building the pyramids, building temples, damming rivers, changing the course of rivers through emboldening, draining marshes, all kinds of fantastic things, doing brain surgery and so on. And we're talking about thousands of years ago. So what happened? The answer is a single word, the Maafa. Maafa is a Kiswahili word that means great destruction. And the great destruction in Africa happens in 2 ways. First, Arab people invaded, using or abusing the religion of Islam. And then 6 centuries ago, Europeans did the same thing, using or abusing the religion of Christianity. And I want to address myself to the question of Christianity a bit later. 6 centuries ago, 600 years ago or so, Europe was a small, it still is, geographically small space in the western perimeter of Asia. It has no natural resources. It was a disease-ridden place. The people were fighting among themselves all the time. Read European history, Western European history, this war, that war, religious war, this, that, the other. But then they went around the world, armed to the teeth, and imposed themselves through violence, first military violence, upon other peoples. Check it. Wherever Western Europeans went, there was genocide. They created genocide. Go ask indigenous Americans. Ask Native Americans from North America about the Trail of Tears. Ask the Chinese about the Century of Humiliation. Ask the people of India about famines created by people like Winston Churchill that kill millions. Ask them about the destruction of their own industries and the looting of their country by Britain of trillions of pounds in today's calculation. So what about us, Africa? The Martha, the enslavement of African people. And we must know the consequences of that. We don't have time, but I would ask Cuffy 250 to sponsor, or some other group to sponsor a symposium that goes deeply into what enslavement was and how it still affects our people today. Because we just know that we were enslaved and we don't know what it has meant and what it still means to us. We have to talk about the intergenerational traumas. We have to talk about how people try to make it into our shame when it's really their shame. They're the ones who behaved in this barbaric manner. We have to take possession of our history and know what happened to us. The consequences for us and for the continent of our ancestors still live among us. Europeans use physical violence and violence in every sphere, spiritual wickedness, economic warfare, they're still at it, to subjugate African people. But every time we revolted, and we did that all the time, their ultimate resort was to military violence because they always held and make certain that they held the edge in that regard. Check our history and you're going to see. Political murder of transformative leaders, invasion of countries, all that is part of it. So enslavement, colonialism, neocolonialism, etc., are names given to different aspects of a system organized by Western Europeans to exploit other peoples. And our concern is with African people and more precisely African Guyanese today. So those are different manifestations of the same system of historical oppression and exploitation imposed by Western Europeans in a series of empires. The Portuguese had theirs, the Spaniards, the British, the French, Germans for a little while, and the United States of America. The current hegemonic force, the US empire, is the one that rules some of the world today. And it's being challenged by tectonic shifts in the international neighborhood. And this is what plugs into contemporary history. But I just want to say that the United States is the most recent of a series of European empires, Western European empires. In this case, the location, the land base, is not in Western Europe, it's in North America, but it's still a Western European empire. So what's the sum total of all of this? What do we need to recognize from this? Well, here it is. We still inhabit colonial structures. We, African Guyanese people, still inhabit colonial structures because colonial structures still inhabit us. It doesn't matter which structure, which system you're talking about. The economic system that oppresses us was shaped by the colonial state. Our mental awareness, our minds was shaped by the colonial experience. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Our social system, it doesn't matter which one you look at. It came out of that colonial moment and has been maintained. The structures have been maintained. It might be a change here and there, but for all intents and purposes, we are still dominated by systems set up centuries ago in our past. It's quite a long story to describe how that has been maintained. And Brother Nigel gave you some of the facts about the Portuguese and how they came to wealth, comparative wealth, and African people remain without wealth. It is African people who invented the retail trade in this country. Let me say this. African people invented the retail trade in this country. And Portuguese and other people were deliberately promoted to middle-class status while Africans were oppressed, prevented from attaining middle-class status en masse. A few of us managed to do that, but not in terms of wealth. And how did this occur? It wasn't only the license, the liquor license and so on. The tax system was used against us. The education system, so-called, was used against us. The religious system, Christianity, many of us have a thing about Christianity. We say, don't come between me and my God. And we refuse to examine Christianity. But one of the things I'm recommending is that African people have a new and a different relationship with ourselves and with all institutions, including the church. Think about it. How did the church, the Christian church, get into our lives? It was introduced during the time of enslavement. And it was introduced to enslave us in the most fundamental way, mentally, to tell us turn the other cheek, not to fight. Think about this. If somebody has kidnapped you and subjected you to the horrors of the barracoons, the Middle Passage, and plantation labor, could rape you, your mother, your brother, your sister, anybody, and this happened on the plantations regularly. What are the consequences of that? And how Christian is that? When John Hawkins went to Africa to begin the British leg of enslaving African people, he rode in a ship called the Good Ship Jesus. The Good Ship Jesus. That voyage was sponsored by the Church of England, the British state, the Queen, and he is a private individual. They had Christian prayers aboard every day. So Christianity has been used to entrap us. When, who was the leader of 1823? Come on, let me test here. Okay, good. I heard some murmurings there. I'm wrapping up. When Kwame elected not to kill white people, chief oppressors, he wasn't doing so out of some kind of humanitarian calculation that said this is the best military advantage. He was swayed by the gospel. And if you don't believe me, check South Africa, where Mandela and Tutu said, we must turn the other cheek. Let's have some truth and reconciliation. Around the same time, Jewish people caught an ex-Nazi. The man is 98. He's in a wheelchair. And you know what they told him? You did the crime, bro. So you got to do the time. But we're busy turning the other cheek. And the millions of acres of land stolen from African people by white people in South Africa have not been returned. Not a blade of grass has been returned. But we are good people. The West celebrates Mandela and Tutu, and they know why they're doing that. Let us be aware of this. So what happened to us is that in every single area, our interests have been injured. Systems imposed upon us that are not for us. We have been imprisoned in those systems, spiritually, culturally, economically, and otherwise. We've been taught that we're nothing, that we have no history. We've been cut off from our history. We don't know ourselves. I just want to take 1 minute to give some solutions. Bob Marley, and even before him, Marcus Garvey told us about the people without knowledge of history and culture. It's rootless. And I want us to begin from there and recognize that the restoration of our identity is central to our resurrection, our reconstitution of ourselves. Our restoration of culture is important. We need a new relationship with our past, with our culture, with ourselves, with institutions like Christianity and education. We need to restore cooperatives. That's a whole discourse in itself. And let me say this, that the state, the colonial state, has been responsible for inflicting, managing the imposition of these limiting things upon ourselves, these limiting systems upon African Guyanese. And therefore, it is important for us to calculate to be independent of the state. I'm not saying we mustn't badger the state, make representation to get our just returns, but it's important for us not to become wards of the state or dependent in any way. We need to advocate for the address of the historical injustices suffered and still suffered by our people. We need to train our people in citizenship, the rights of citizens. And above all, let's follow our ancestors. The ancient Egyptians have a phrase, Wehemi Mesu, and it means the repeating of the births. Africans in Ghana talk about, and other wells, talk about Sankofa. Let us revisit our past to identify things that are important for finding solutions in the present. We have work to do, and I ask us, I implore us, I dare us to begin to do this more and more together. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Nehusi. And we're going to skip the questions for obvious reasons. The next presenter is going to be Vincent Alexander. Then we move to Mr. Paul Slow, then Sister Holder Kush, yes. And right. So Vincent, Mr. Paul Slow, then Sister Kush, and then we're going to open it up for general questions because we're running a little bit behind time. Thank you. Let's welcome Vincent.
Thank you very much, Bwana Mwenyekiti Hamjambo Menzangu. I have been asked to speak about the state of things in this decade from the perspective of Ipadaji. But before I do that, I want to do two things as a rejoinder to what Nigel said earlier. Nigel recognized certain persons for the work they're doing. And like a good African, in a state of humility, he omitted himself. So I would like to join him. He has, in fact, been doing a fantastic job in the course of this struggle that we're ensuing. He made the point about the importance, and it's been made repeatedly, the importance of education and the significance of free education in 1974. And I always like to take the opportunity when the question of free education is mentioned to share with people my own experience. When I did common entrance, I qualified to go to one of the paid schools. And in fact, in those days, all of the schools were paid, though some people got scholarships to 5, QC to St. Joseph. But all of the schools were paid schools. And I qualified for tutorial high school. I couldn't go because my mother, I didn't say my parents, right? My mother couldn't afford to send me. And so I stayed back in primary school for one additional year, wishing and hoping the chance would come for me to be able to go to high school. That chance only came because the next year I sat every entrance exam across the country, every entrance exam. I passed all of them. And Chatham, a school that no longer exists, gave me a partial scholarship. The fees was $40 a term. My scholarship was $15 a term for the first 3 years. And my big sister, who has just started to teach, says, the fact that I demonstrated a desire to go to high school, that she will pay my fees from her salary. And that's how I went to high school. So I have a tremendous appreciation and understanding of what free education means. And find it unacceptable when I've had cause to read in our papers in the past, some of the elites criticizing free education because they could have afforded education, and they don't know that free education can be compared to quality, good or bad education. Can only be compared to not having an education. I think we need to understand that. Copy 250 is with us once again, 2023. Looking at the state of the African Guyanese. But they're doing so once again in a year of the decade for the people of African descent, a decade declared by the United Nations. And therefore, whilst we look at the state of African Guyanese, my task is to look at this decade and what movement has there been, if there has been any, in relation to the people of African descent. And in many regards, you can take all of the contributions made so far and to be made in that context. What has happened during this decade? But before I proceed to that, I want to take you back a wee bit as to why we have this decade. And I first of all want to reference the Durban Conference and to remind you that in the Durban Conference, there was a declaration, one of the provisions of which says, recognizing that failure to combat and denounce racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance by all, especially by public authorities and politicians at all levels, is a factor encouraging their perpetuation, the perpetuation of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances. That was one of the clauses in the Durban Declaration, a declaration that led to the decade. Another clause says, reaffirming that states have the duty to protect and promote the human rights and fundamental freedoms of all victims, and that they should apply a gender perspective, recognizing the multiple forms of discrimination which women can face, and that the enjoyment of their civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights is essential for the development of societies throughout the world. And replacing gender there, in this instance, to cater for all beings. Here is what that Durban Declaration said. And so we ask ourselves, what has occurred? Has there been change? What have our politicians and public authorities been doing in relation to this call by the Durban Declaration? We can attribute to the United Nations the declaration of the decade with specific objectives. One, to strengthen national, regional, and international action. National, regional, and international action, and cooperation in relation to the full enjoyment of economic, social, cultural, civic, and political rights by people of African descent, and their full and equal participation in all aspects of the society. Two fundamental things there, enjoying the rights and full participation. Two, to promote a greater knowledge of and respect for the diverse heritage, culture, and contribution of the people of African descent to the development of societies. And three, to adopt and strengthen national, regional, and international legal frameworks in accordance with the Durban Declaration and the Program of Action and International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and to ensure their full and effective implementation. This is what was intended, starting with the Durban Declaration, coming on to the United Nations Declaration of a Decade for the people of African descent. It is These objectives that inspired the formation of IPADG in pursuit of the objectives. At that time, with the encouragement, if not the initiative of the state. That's how IPADG came about, in pursuit of these. It therefore meant that IPADG had a mandate to be pursued in two ways. To be pursued in terms of how the people themselves could come to the plate, how the people of African descent themselves could be organized to come to the plate, to the table, but also to be pursued in a manner that required the state to take certain actions in response to those objectives. In the instance of Guyana, the then government in 2013 signed on to the Declaration of the United Nations. They signed on. But have they, in fact, fulfilled any of the obligations to which they signed on? And my answer would be simply no. Would be simply no. Notwithstanding what these declarations said about the state of the people of African descent, we have a situation where our government says we appreciate and recognize the people of African descent because they struggle for emancipation. Full recognition. But beyond that, they're now in a state where all of us are equal, and the government is doing everything for everybody, and there's no need for special attention to the people of African descent. That is not what this declaration spoke about. The declaration sought to say that there was need for special attention. And in fact, the word they use, that has been used today, is for equitable attention. Equitable attention. IPADG has sought to pursue these objectives. We have sought, for example, to fund night schools. You heard about education, you heard about catching up. We have sought to fund night schools. In stopping this subvention, one of the things the government did is to stop or attempt to stop the funding of night schools. People are caught up out there about whether Alexander get money and take money. Even if I take money, the impact of what they've done is not to deprive me of taking money alone. It's to deprive our children the opportunity of attending night schools. The IPADG has sought through donations to continue the work of those two night schools, one in Kinadonan and one here in Sophia. And we have to be grateful to those teachers who've said to us they understand the plight of IPADG and the children, and they don't hassle us for payment, though we try to pay them whenever the money is available. IPADG has made a submission for the training of seafarers, a program to train seafarers. That's the lower level of the oil and gas and the maritime industry. We have the curriculum, we have the person who will deliver, All we want the government to do is to give that program the recognition, because the way oil and gas and the maritime industry is organized, if you aren't trained in a recognized place, you ain't going nowhere no matter how much training you get. We have sought to use GITC as the conduit for that purpose. That proposal is languishing. It had nothing to do with the subvention, but it is today languishing in the education system for want of action, where we want to train young people. Like we did when we first came on board. It's almost an untold story that we got funds from basic needs, and trained 50 auto electricians at GITC at no cost to them. 50 of them were trained in our very first, I think it was our first year, 2018, 2019. Ipadaji has approached the last and present government on the question of the teaching of history and the manner in which it's taught in our schools. We approached them at a time when they were doing curriculum reform. We could never get a meeting with the minister on this matter. But we work at a lower level, made approaches, made propositions, and we're told when we're doing reform, we'll work with it. When I inquired recently what has become of the reform in history, I was told they only reform the core subjects. And in Guyana, history is not a core subject. So that too is languishing. We also approached the government on the question of the reinstituting of village councils. Not to dismantle the regions, not to dismantle the neighborhoods, but to have village councils reinstituted. Because for all intents and purposes, the present local government system has imposed aliens and put them in charge of lands that were purchased. I use a fancy words like ancestral lands. Lands which were purchased by our ancestors have fallen into the hands and the control of people who don't look like us. And the idea was that at minimum, if you had village councils and you returned the responsibility for lands to those councils, at minimum, it would fall under the control of those who look like us. And hopefully they'll be thinking like us. But that's another problem. And we talked about mental slavery earlier. That is still something that has not been addressed. Although our Constitution, and if I'm not mistaken, is Article 72, provides for the institution of village councils at the behest of the villagers. And a resolution was passed in this room calling on the government to reinstitute village councils. That is still to happen. Ipadaji started its work probably wrong-footed. In 2017, when we were working and developing Ipadaji, it was brought to our attention that there were funds available at basic needs and funds available at the small business bureau. And we collected a number of projects coming down to the end of 2017 and went off to those places with those projects to try to get them funded. A few were funded. The most successful was the auto electrician. The one with the greatest potential was the fishing project in Victoria, which we ourselves turned off because of internal village problems. But that project was intended to relocate a fish operation in Victoria and to do training of the youth in Victoria to get involved in fishing. And the facility would have taken off the fish. There was no question of a market for the fish. And the monies were allocated by basic needs for that project, but our own quibbling caused it not to happen. But I mentioned that to say that that approach at the very inception created a fervor in our community for funding of projects. And when the strategy failed to deliver on the funding of projects, then there were some problems. But the fact of the matter is, conceptually, and if you listen to the objectives I mentioned, our main task was not the funding of projects, because the funding of projects don't necessarily address the issues, the institutional issues, and the legal issues, which are historical and continuing, that have caused the people of African descent to be in the state that they're in. That doesn't mean we should have projects, but I'm saying that will not be the fundamental redress to our problem. And so sometime last year, we caught ourselves in some regards and sat down and started to work out what we refer to as the priorities in terms of what we think the state should be doing. And having worked those out, then is when we wrote the president and said, let's have a talk. Because by then we were prepared to put all of the issues on the table. And in our own minds, we were saying what should happen. We speak with the president first, and then we have sectoral talks, education, agriculture, etc. Those talks got nothing to do with who thief money or if people stole money. It has to do with advancing the objectives of the decade. To date, having written the president thrice, and the president having promised thrice, there have been no talks. But what I have heard him say when he addressed some people of African descent, at least by pigmentation, at State House, is that he will be speaking to the people directly, to the communities directly. In other words, he ain't talking to Padaji. And he said that in Mocha Arcadia as well. I'm not talking to your elected representatives. And Jagdio said it in Plaisance. I ain't talking to the council. And so what we see is a government that is refusing, in the circumstance of even a constitution that says they must talk. You have heard about Article 14. And if you go to Article 13, that article tells you the obligation the state has to speak with the people about matters that affect them. And we're living in a state that openly and blatantly refuses to have the conversation in the decade on matters about the decade. And so that is really the problem we have got to confront at this time. How do we bring the state to the table? How we ensure that the state takes its obligations, legal obligations, moral obligations, inherited obligations, because it's the successor state of those states that brought us to where we're at. How do we get them to the table to do what they should be doing? How do we get them to understand that the narrative of equality does not reflect the reality of Guyana? That the reality of Guyana is that the people of African descent, as has been told to you today already, have been affected by historical systems and policies that has disadvantages us, not only materially, but in the worst case, psychologically. And that there is need for the redress because we have inherited all of the consequences of those policies, in as much as the policies are still continuing. Nigel mentioned the continuation in terms of how contracts are distributed. It has nothing to do with equity. Who got money got luck, or who got money get bargain. That's what the Northman they say. Who got money get bargain. Black people got money, they can't get no bargain. So who get money get bargain. So colleagues, my little presentation is all about the fact that we've embarked upon a decade. From our side, the side of the people of African descent, we have sought to put mechanisms in place to address the issues that ought to be addressed. But that these issues cannot be addressed outside of the state. And I'm particularly saying the state as opposed to the government. But of course, the government is a part of the state. It is the machinery of the state. Cannot be addressed outside. And we are faced with a government that, first of all, refuses to recognize the real state of people of African descent, refuses to have the conversation to address the matter. The United Nations say there should be a program. Our government has no program and never reported to the United Nations. Its Paddy G has gone to the United Nations on occasions. And Jagdeo said we were sneaking off to go to the UN. That's how we described our attendance at the UN, as sneaking off. But having sneaked off 2 times, when the 3rd meeting came in the UN in New York, they sent the Minister of Tourism. They didn't send the responsible minister. The same minister who turned up the other day if it knew something. That is the African minister, the Minister of Tourism. They sent the man from the ERC, who should be solving the problem in Guyana, went to make an excuse for the government. And they sent one of our own to the UN to tell the UN not to say what the program is, not to report as they should report, but to say don't listen to these other people who sneaking off to come and speak with you. So that's the situation we're faced with, an attempt to erase from the face of the Guyanese landscape the body of people who are trying to represent the interests of the people of African descent. And by that consequence, to also negatively impact, if not erase, the issues of the people of African descent from the agenda of Guyana. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brother Vincent. We'll have a slight adjustment. We'll have Sister Kush go next, and then Mr. Paul Slow will wrap up this segment of our program. Please let us welcome Don Holder Kush, an attorney at law and public advocate. Sister Don.
Thank you. I believe it's King David, correct?
Not quite king.
But it's King Eric, it's Chief and Chief Eric? or King-
Chief Eric. Yeah.
Chief Eric is here?
No.
He was here earlier. And I want to acknowledge the former Prime Minister and former Mayor of the city of Georgetown, Mr. Hamilton Green. Welcome all. Everybody been talking and talking. You hear it? Everybody crying out for peace. Nobody's crying out for justice. These two basic human rights are elusive to most people of African descent in Guyana. When the current Vice President Barrack Jabio was president, he attended an India Day parade and he's quoted as saying, India is alive and well in Guyana. Eli? Eli? I recall giving that information to Nigel Hughes because that was during the King Kong trial. It is indeed an honor to be invited by Cuffy to be a member of this illustrious panel. And more importantly, the only woman. I will not let the women down, as my voice is theirs. The topic of this whole session is one-sided justice in one Guyana. It's very timely. Justice, in the broadest sense, is the concept that individuals are to be treated in a manner that is equitable and fair. That does not exist in Guyana, unfortunately. So we have one-sided justice, which is some individuals being treated in a manner that is equitable and fair. And those persons who don't get that because they tend to look like us. One Guyana, the president, His Excellency Dr. Irfan Ali said, is a social contract of inclusion. One Guyana's vision is about creating a more equal society, guaranteeing that everyone is afforded the opportunity to lead productive and happy lives, as well as reducing inequality in access to education, health, employment, income, and justice. Well, I don't know what President Ali is talking about. It certainly doesn't relate to the Guyana I live in. If you're speaking of justice, the place where one goes to seek justice is the court. The Honorable Attorney General, before he was Attorney General, he bragged about his government bringing the constitutional reform after the Hurd-Manson Accord, which was signed by Her Excellency President Janet Jagan and opposition leader Mr. Hugh Desmond Hoyt, OE Senior Counsel, in St. Lucia in July 1998. As a result of this accord, there was constitutional reform. And Mr. Nandalal, as he then was, claimed glory that came from the change in the Constitution, making it the first in the English-speaking Caribbean to provide for agreement by the President and the Honorable Opposition Leader to agree to the appointment of the Chancellor and Chief Justice. In April 7, 2022, Guyana Times reported that the Honorable Attorney General, Minister of Legal Affairs, Mr. Anil Nandalal, SC, MP, stated that in the current formula that requires consensus between the President and Opposition Leader has not worked in the more than 2 decades it was put in place. So we have an acting Chancellor, Madam Justice Yonit Cummins, ORCCH, and an acting Chief Justice, Madam Justice Roxanne George, CCH, SC, in those positions for 6 years. The President has not come out and said when this will happen or what will happen. It is disrespectful to our top judicial officers to be acting for so many years. So Dennis Byron, QC, PC, former president of the Caribbean Court of Justice, and the current president of the Caribbean Court of Justice, Mr. Justice Adrian Saunders, commented negatively on this situation. One would have thought that that would be enough embarrassment to push this government to confirm these 2 young ladies of the highest integrity, brilliant, humble, and well respected by members of the bar, and 2 presidents of the CCJ. The opposition leader made it clear that he supported their consummation. You know what came after that? Minister Gail Teixeira said, no, that's not how it goes. The president will tell you, and then you will respond. But we're not dealing with that, right? Right on the Constitution is one thing. But these ladies have been acting for 6 years. And I ask all the ladies here, hope when you see me protesting, y'all come and join me, please. They are now members of the Judicial Service Commission. These ladies are now members of the Judicial Service Commission. And part of their jobs is to appoint judges and magistrates who will be confirmed while they remain acting. I believe that Nigel, the retirement age, retirement age for the chancellor is 72. The chancellor is 72. Retirement age for the chancellor. 72, I think. Yeah, I think the chancellor retires at 72. So I don't know if they're gonna have Justice Cummins acting until she's 72 years old. In the judicial system, those who may have committed minor offenses are either remanded or placed on reasonable bail but can't afford it. Then those with deep pockets can afford the best lawyers, one who's here today. But he also does a lot of good work for the people. We have junior lawyers working with them, doing research, and at times doing the preliminary inquiry. But probably the most glaring example in my mind that happened to somebody of African descent is what happened to Brigadier Godfrey Best in the Guyanese Defense Force. Godfrey Best acted as the Chief of Staff of the Guyanese Defense Force until the day before he retired, and he was confirmed as Chief of Staff. At that same function at the President's office, Colonel Omar Khan was promoted to Brigadier, and the President presented him with his instruments to perform the functions of the Chief of Staff. I mean, that is just so, this man has acted all the time. You're going to confirm him one day before, but that's what they did. Now you have Mr. Charandas Prasad, who was responsible for the new coalition losing the no confidence motion. He returned to Canada, and later he was appointed High Commissioner to India, where he allegedly was verbally abusive to an elderly woman who attempted to look after stray animals. It took this government months to bring this man home. And the Starbuck News recently reported that Mr. Charandas Prasad is still on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs payroll. This reminds me of the King Kong case that Mr. Nigel Hughes at the time was representing one, Mr. Freddie Kissoon, who was sued by Ivara Jagdeo for commenting Freddie said he was King Kong. And the late Dr. Roger Luncheon said on the oath, on the cross-examination, that there were no qualified Blacks to be appointed ambassadors and high commissioners. There's one right here today, Ambassador Raw Lucas. Right? You also have Ambassador Miles, Ambassador Ronald Austin, Cedric Joseph, and many others. But Dr. Luncheon, I don't know if he believed it or he was told he had to say it. I really don't know. The justice system must be fair. If a settlement is to be offered to the deceased families, sorry, I think I missed something here. Anyway, I'm talking about the Mahdia situation. The government offered them a settlement of $5 million, the families. If a settlement is to be offered to, it should follow the way the courts would work out the figure for loss of life as a result of the government's negligence. The Guyana Fire Service said on 2 occasions they visited the dorm and the school and found them to be heavily grilled and padlocked. The last visit was in February 2023. And this was communicated to the school officials. I don't know if this was communicated to the Minister of Education. The Honorable Attorney General's settlement of $5 million to each child that died to their parents is ludicrous. In calculating damages for loss of life, are factors to be considered: age, potential earnings, and emotional distress, among others. One child was 5 years old, the others between 15 and 16. yet the formula to calculate damage was not applied. That is not justice for the families whose children perished in a fire. When they had the COI into Linden, the commissioners sent back what they recommended to be paid, and the figures were different. Figures were different for everybody. One got 3, one got 2, and one got $1 million. And from Mad, I go to Monrepo. The vendors at the Monrepo market suffered loss after protest action arising out of an incident at Golden Grove. The persons charged with terrorism are represented by Dexter Todd and me, so I won't want to say much. One vendor claimed she lost $3 million in palouri, egg balls, curry, and fish cake. The government provided a $100,000 grant the next day after the incident without any verification. But the vendors were not happy, and some claimed their losses were in excess of $500,000. The Minister of Human Services and Social Security, Dr. Vinaya Prasad, along with other government officials, distributed boxes containing 70 pounds of frozen bangameri. The compensation was paid the following days. I said, who got luck, eat pork. We see multi-storied buildings going up all the time, and fancy cars, the Lamborghinis and so on, while our people struggle to make ends meet. One Guyana is not inclusive, it is exclusive, right? It is meant to benefit the people who support the People's Progressive Party / Civic, if the Civic still exists. How long are we going to sit around and beg the government to do what the Constitution said they must do? Treat us with equal rights. Our ancestors did not come on no Hesperus or the Whitby. Many were the documents, tradition, and culture intact. More than 4 million of our ancestors came on slave ships in the most inhumane conditions. We were branded as property of the slave master, given English names, including David, and converted to Christianity. Our cry has always been for justice and one-sided justice in our country, where the motto is one people, one nation, one destiny. There's urgent need for a public conversation. This administration has to be respectfully involved to have a conversation with the Black agenda. We need equal rights and justice, and I believe that is the most important thing at this stage. And I thank you all for listening to me. One love to my brothers and sisters. Let's all work together.
Thank you very much, Sister Dawn. We are now going to have Mr. Paul Slow. The technicians, are you all set? No? All right, over to the technicians.
Good afternoon, one and all. Can you hear me? Technicians, I need confirmation that you can hear me before I proceed. I guess I am seeing a comment here that yes, I can be heard. Just want confirmation. I don't want to proceed unless the technicians advise me that I'm good to go. People are saying yes, so I think I'll commence.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Good afternoon to all the persons present, those live and those who are on the virtual platform. I want to commence by taking this opportunity to congratulate Cuffy 250 and thank them for offering me this opportunity to make this brief presentation on security. During the presentation, I look at the subject that I was asked to speak on, that is public security, and I will do so
with reference to today's theme, which is the state of the African Guyanese in a one-sided one Guyana. I look at a few areas. I will briefly touch on what is public security. Then I'll tell you who is responsible for public security. Then I will look at the role of the Guyana Police Force in relation to public security, the structure of the force to carry out its mandate. I will look at the marginalization of Afro-Guyanese policemen and women, the weaponization of the Guyana Police Force against Afro-Guyanese. I look at the crime figures because that will give you some context when we speak about public safety. Now, and then I'll close by making a few recommendations. Now, public security or public safety, as some people refer to it, is the same thing, is the prevention of and protection from events that could endanger the safety and security of the public from significant danger, injury, or property damage. Public security refers to provision of law enforcement, emergency medical service, fire prevention and suppression, and emergency management by local government entities. Public safety is the responsibility of the government. It has to ensure the protection of citizens, persons in the territory, organizations, and institutions against threat to their well-being, survival, and prosperity. In Guyana, the primary agency for the provision of public security is the Guyana Police Force. Other agencies include the Guyana Fire Service, the Guyana Prison Service, and the Guyana Defense Force. I must add that the role of the Guyana Defense Force in public safety is to support the civil authority, i.e. the police. Now let me look on the Guyana Police Force, because as we said, it is the primary agency for public safety and security. As stated above, the Guyana Police Force is the primary law enforcement organization in Guyana and therefore plays a critical role in the provision of public safety and security. The role of the Guyana Police Force is outlined in Section 3.2 of the Police Act of the Laws of Guyana, Chapter 16:01. And it says it's the prevention and detection of crime, the preservation of law and order, the repression of internal disturbance, the protection of property, the apprehension of offenders, and the due enforcement of all laws and regulations with which it is directly charged. I will posit here that for the force to deliver its mandate, the members must be carefully selected, well-trained and equipped, competently led, strategically deployed, free from political control and interference, and properly and adequately remunerated. The empirical evidence before us suggests that the force currently lacks those critical ingredients and consequently is currently incapable of providing the level of public safety and security that is critical if Guyana is to develop. Now, the police force is divided into 12 regional police divisions, which are generally aligned with the 10 administrative regions of the country. These are in addition to several branches at force headquarters. Due to historical factors, the Guyana Police Force has a numerical dominance of African men and women. It is suggested that many factors, including government policies, religious beliefs, demographics, among others, have led to this situation. Over the years, there have been several commissions, including the Disciplined Forces Commission of 2004, that have looked at this numerical imbalance and made recommendations to address the same. However, despite all efforts, the imbalance remains.
Oh, there you are.
Since assuming office in 2020, the
It's very nice.
current government
Old time say,
has
that's
made a concerted effort to place Indian Guyanese police officers
Where you
in
going out there, donkey?
management positions
Oh, I thought you
at
put
the
it on.
expense of their more I think I was muted there a bit by mistake. I was saying that since assuming office in 2020, the current government has made a concerted effort to place Indian Guyanese police officers in senior management position at the expense of their more experienced African Guyanese counterpart. Currently, regional police divisions 1, 2, 3, 4B, 4C, 6, and 8 are commanded by Indo-Guyanese police officers. In many of those cases, the second in command and other key positions are also held by inexperienced and unqualified Indian Guyanese police officers. In addition, several other important departments within the force, such as operations, SOCU, finance, are held by Indian Guyanese police officers, most of whom, I submit, are unqualified and lack the necessary experience to occupy those important senior positions. Many hold the view, with justification I might add, that the only reason these officers are placed in those important positions is because of their ethnicity and the perception that they support the current government. The converse is also true. That is, the only reason that many qualified and experienced African policemen and women are denied senior positions is because of their ethnicity and the perception that they support the opposition political parties. It is significant to note that most of the regional police divisions commanded by Indian Guyanese police officers are in the major population centers of Guyana. On the other hand, the regional police division commanded by Afro-Guyanese policemen, apart from Regional Police Division 4A, 5, and 10, are in the remote areas of Guyana with sparse population. It was also noted, and this is very significant, it was also noted that during the last promotion of senior officers in July 2022, Indian police officers were favored ahead of their African counterparts. And let me give you some figures here to support this contention. Of the 8 persons promoted to the rank of Assistant Commissioner of Police, only 3 were Africans. In the case of the 11 ranks promoted to Senior Superintendent, only 4 were Africans. Oh, wow. In the case of Senior Superintendent, only 8 of the 21 ranks who were promoted were African policemen. Disproportionalities were observed in the lower rank structure. This disproportionality is difficult to justify given the numerical dominance of African policemen and women in the force, many of whom are highly qualified and experienced. There can be no doubt that given the important legal mandate of the Guyana Police Force, it has a critical role to play in the maintenance of public safety and security. And this requires well-motivated members. There is compelling evidence that in recent years, the Guyana Police Force has been weaponized by the current administration to go after African Guyanese, especially those in the opposition political parties and persons perceived to be supporters of the of those parties. And we have some examples. Don alluded to, we have the former Minister of Finance, Winston Jordan, arrested and charged with misconduct. Someone earlier mentioned the case of Takumu Gunsi, was arrested, charged for attempting to incite racial hostility. What was very concerning about that entire incident is that the police issued a wanted bulletin, as is their want now, without making any effort to contact Ogunsi. And over the past years, we have seen that has become a practice. And Ogunsi, having turned himself in the company of his lawyer, was denied bail and kept in custody for 72 hours. He was then shackled, handcuffed, and taken to court to answer the charge. More recently, we had the case of former Minister of Public Infrastructure, David Patterson, who is charged under the Sexual Offences Act for exposing his genitals. The circumstances clearly suggest that it's a case of indecent exposure under the Summary Jurisdiction Act. And then we had this egregious act, the arrest of Attorney-at-Law Tamika Clark, a female African, on October 28, 2022, by ranks of the Special Organized Crime Unit for advising our client to remain silent during questioning by the police. That one gained a lot of publicity. We know that civil action was brought. The Chief Justice found that the police acted unconstitutionally, and I think damages are to be awarded. And on the other hand, persons who are associated with the current government are given a free pass. We have the well-publicized case of former Minister of Local Government, Nigel Damlal, who was accused of grooming, raping, and sodomizing a 16-year-old indigenous schoolgirl. The investigation that followed that can only be described as a travesty of justice. Suffice to say that the Director of Public Prosecutions clearly went against the relevant laws when she recommended to the police that Damlal should not face any criminal charges. Another example, we had the Regional Executive Officer of Region 9, Carl Singh, accused of shooting a 25-year-old woman in her abdomen in Letem. And this is another case of an indigenous woman being victimized. That is in July 2021. It was reported that he was sent on leave pending investigation. He was made to resume duties and was never charged. There are numerous other cases which clearly shows that the system discriminates against African Guyanese. The current situation in the Guyana Police Force cries out for disaggregated information. Attorney Nigel Hughes spoke about disaggregated information so that one can get a better understanding of the gravity of the discrimination against African policemen and women within the force. And I say here too that there is also empirical evidence that African Guyanese, especially males, are victims of unlawful profiling by the police. The same is true with respect to African villages and communities. I want to close by saying that despite the figures given by the Guyana Police Force claiming that crimes are down, the president parroted the same statement not so long ago, public security in Guyana is in a perilous situation. The World of Statistics in its 2022 report stated that Guyana has the 7th highest crime rate in the world, and that is per capita. Only Trinidad and Tobago in the English-speaking Caribbean at number 6 has a higher crime rate. Only recently, in July last month, the United States Embassy in Guyana issued an advisory to its citizens, which stated, and I quote here, reconsider travel to Guyana due to crime. Violent crime, including murder and robbery, is common, especially at night. They go on to say, local police often lack the resources to respond effectively to serious criminal incidents. From this, we can safely say that public safety and security in Guyana, as I alluded to before, is in a perilous position. In terms of recommendations, I would think, as I said, there is need for disaggregated information about the Guyana Police Force. And what we're talking about here, what are the numbers? What's the strength? How many males, how many females, how many African Guyanese, how many Indian Guyanese? And then we can go by rank structure. And that will give a clearer picture as to what the real situation is. And as Nigel said, once you get that, then you can think about interventions. You can think about equity and all of that. Without that, you are not likely to address the main issues. And then I say here too, drastic reform of the Guyana police force, especially senior personnel practices, must be done. If we want to bring public safety and security to some acceptable level, we have got to talk about the reorganization of the force. I say here too, that the force must be made to act independently and professionally. This was alluded to by some of the earlier presenters. There's no doubt when we see how the force currently acts, they do not act in a professional way. And if you do not act in a professional way, you're not going to get the much needed cooperation from members of the public so that you can be on top of public safety and security. And then the last recommendation I have here is that the force must be free from political interference. The force must be free from political interference. I mentioned the case earlier with the attorney Tamika Clark, who was arrested by the police for advising her client not to give a statement to the police. And in that matter, the Attorney General is on record as saying that he called the person in charge of the unit and either instruct or advise them to send the attorney away. That is political interference. The Attorney General has no right to call a unit in the Guyana Police Force to give instructions. And that is only one example. So I close by saying that, again, that these issues have to be addressed in a very comprehensive manner. If we do not do that, we're not going to be, or the police are not going to be in a position to provide the necessary public safety and security that is so needed if we are going to, if the country in this oil and gas industry is to develop. I thank you much for your attention, and I will be part of the panel to field any questions that the audience or anyone in the virtual sphere may have. Thank you very much.
So,
We're now going to have a question and answer period. Is there a mic, a microphone for questions? Brother Royston is going to do the honors. Please indicate, and Brother Royston, try to make your question as pointed as possible. If you desire a particular panelist, please say so. We will entertain comments, but keep them within reasonable limits. So the floor is now open.
Good evening to each and everyone. Very interested, huh? My name is U October, aka U the Prince Magic. Young businessman. It's not a matter of questions, it's a matter of situations that been facing all people over a period of time. When remember in 2 bytes again, eh? When a simple listen to some things that coming up, I remember one idea. They always take one of us, just to say it's one of us, just to do one of us. And I will start with Mr. Hughes. I'm not asking a question. I just saying from my observation over a period of time. Remember, you represent me years back without consent when the police give me a hard time. You know what I'm talking about, that wasn't my rights. But I have heard Mr. Douglas said Mr. Hughes would never return as senior counsel under his watch and Mr. Ramata watch. And then we had the coalition there. And up to now, Mr. Hughes is not a senior counsel. Very sad, very embarrassing. Now we talk about these judges and these lawyers and these things. We had a chance We had Mr. Paul Williams. Did we confirm him? The answer is no. So we need to stop making miscellaneous excuse for shortcomings towards the nature of life in general. I did not celebrate this year emancipation, nor Barnum anniversary, and I say why. There's nothing there to celebrate. Last year, the 37 year to take the drummers there, that was not acknowledged. What is there? Something is happening in this country, people not realizing. The time for trade men in this country of African descent is over. They're not paying the city hall. The private sector and others not paying the city hall the money they're supposed to pay. But they're giving contracts to the Indian brothers, subcontract to the black brothers and sisters to put you into the gutter for $10,000, $15,000, making you security guards for 10 or maybe $15,000 a day to tell you you're doing a good job. So at the time, I'm not going to spend money to educate my daughter or my son, because going in the gutter and getting people out is the day of war. Thank you. I say no more.
Yeah, for sure. Respecting the time constraint, I'll be very brief. I think one of the most important things to address, which is the elephant in the room, from my perspective as a young individual, is the notable absence of young people in these type of discussions. That is something that is quite. Yes, that's correct. Right, correct. It's quite, based on what my brother is saying here, it's quite evident. And the thing is, I wouldn't have been here if my father didn't ask me to sit in his stead. He's not well, so he asked me to come. So if he didn't notify me, or if he didn't ask me to come, I wouldn't have known such an event was taking place in the first place. So I think a few things have to be looked at. I don't think any question is needed, because what has been discussed, I can honestly say from a young perspective, these things have been discussed time and over again. The statistics is very important, no doubt about that. But the thing is it's a case of where the younger generation, we have access to technology, so information is like out there. And some of the things we cannot escape what we're experiencing on a day-to-day basis. So these things are quite evident. I think we have to gravely look at, one, how this is being marketed, because of the fact that I didn't even know this was taking place. So that's something to look at. Second, young people have to be engaged in this type of discussion, because it affects us more than anything else, based on the stats that you listed out. Whereas you said 50% of the dropout rate within our schools, it's of course young people. So that's something that we have to look at. We have to take a very harsh look on the message, which is the reason as to why there's an absence of young presence. Because of the fact that if you look right now, whether we know it or not, young people are the generation of, we are the fulfillment generation. I hope I'm saying that right. So if your message is not in line with the purpose in which we are here, of course, we would not be interested. If we look at the revolutions that are currently taking place right now, whether it's within Mali, Burkina Faso, within South Africa, you look at EFF and the voice of EFF, there are young individuals that are backing that. So we have to take a look, a very strong look at our message, and is it a message that puts us on a path where we can accomplish full and complete liberation in this lifetime? So that's something that we have to look at, definitely indeed. Some of the solutions that were put forward, which my brother here touched on some very deep topics, and he's absolutely right. I think given the fact, the nature of this type of discussion, we're putting time constraints on it. I think we do ourselves a disservice. And brother's absolutely right. At least we have to come together, pool our resources if need be, and have more sessions like this. Look at our marketing, ensure that we have a young presence here, because it affects us most importantly, once again. I didn't get a chance to note on everything, but brother, I think Nigel Hughes also touched on education. as being one of those solutions. I agree to a certain extent. What type of education are we put forwarding? I think that is the most important thing. Also, Mr. Alexander said the same thing as well. And I think Brother touched on it quite briefly, which is a case of identity. Not only that, is that the education system is rather archaic, which contributes to the dropout rate that we're seeing right now. So what we have, it's a case of where we're trying to force a certain type of knowledge, which is totally outdated, on individuals who already have access to a wide amount of information right now. So it doesn't goes hand in hand, which contributes to that high dropout rate that brother is talking about. We have to have an education that teaches us to build a nation on our own, not a case of a type of education system where we are used as pawns and tools, and we have to go into a pre-existing system where it's already stacked against us. I think that is something I have to look at. I'm trying to force all of this in. But I think, we have to take a very strong look at education, what we're talking about, the solutions that we're put forwarding. I can honestly say I'm not really, I don't mean this as a disrespect. I don't hear enough solutions. I'm just hearing, we're highlighting the problems that we already know exist. What do we do next? How do we gain access to lands? How do we gain access to resources? How do we pull our resources as a people to do for ourselves rather than we looking to someone else outside of our community? How do we, right now at this present state, take charge of our communities, our villages in this present state, and not necessarily wait until we have the next 5 years for voting and all of that? I think those of all of that you have mentioned has already been done before. So I wouldn't even be interested in coming here if we're talking about the same thing. I'll be quite honest with you. I'm looking for solutions. I'm looking for, if you're going to say, hey, tomorrow we're going to do this, we're going to assemble, this is what we're going to do, not protest and all of that. Yes, protest has its place, but it's kind of being used in the wrong direction. Let's be more solution oriented and have more sessions like this, be serious about it, and provide us with ample time to deal with these issues. Last comment, I promise. A decade, 10 years to look at our issues of gross insult. $100 million, which is some subventions, is a gross insult. The mere fact that we have been enslaved for over 200-300 years, how is it that you're going to give us just 10 years to look at this issue and offer $1 million? That's just totally ridiculous in my mind. So, man, yeah, we just have to, as elders within the room, we just have to do better and not just keep these kind of forums just for taking pictures and to say that we're doing something. It's just, we just need to do better. We need to reassess this kind of talk and maybe go back to the drawing board and just come back. Not necessarily go back to the drawing board. The solutions are there. Everybody is doing it in America, in South Africa, the African states, all over the world. We're seeing this revolution. So just take it seriously.
My name is Kenneth Daniels, Kenneth I. Daniels. The 7 other Kenneth Daniels is in Georgetown. And my main interest is on the education factor. I live back, and I was quite not surprised. Surprised is the worst word. To find
I'm not smelling it. I'll wash it out here and put it in the sun.
A lot of my nieces and nephews and young people had failed their maths and English 3, 4, 5, 10 years ago, and no effort was made to correct it.
But Bean,
I find young people writing their CXCs and don't know what they want to do afterwards. And they don't understand the difference between a job, a profession, and a career. And I'm asking myself, what has happened? And then they feel that because of oil, and they're at the bottom of the barrel, that there's nothing for them. I am only 77¾ years young. And this is what I've learned in all my years. Whatever we need to do, whether oil or no oil, we need a foundation. And that foundation is not just getting some certificates. We need the certificates, but we need some counseling. We need some academic counseling in school. We need them to know what they want to do, not sit back and wait for the sky to fall in. What are we, as this group, recognizing the value of education, how much have we put in to change the mindset of our grandchildren, our children, that they must make an effort to get the foundation of education?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, friends, the family. One question I have for the legal team up here, Council Hughes and Madam Council Kush. Are we saying, I heard you refer to Irfan Ali as His Excellency the President. Are you recognizing Irfan Ali as the duly elected President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana? Because for once I can recognize that there is still a petition before the court. One has been dismissed. The other one is there, petition 88. That's one. Two, gas to shore. There's supposed to be a gas to shore project that costs over several $1 billion. I know the figure directly. Is this gathering prepared to write to the US government, namely Mr. Hakeem Jeffries, who is supposed to convene, to my knowledge, convene a conference on on Guyana, a 2 days conference. Are you prepared to write to that conference that all aspect of funding for that gas to shore project be halted unless and until there be the Guyana government give a commitment to clean voters lists and biometrics? Another question. My solution to the problem in Guyana is in the African community. I would like to suggest that all African villages throughout Guyana, this forum adopted that all African village throughout Guyana, at least 2 weeks of public protests to highlight the village's grievances and plights. 2 weeks of protests. And the other question I was wanted to pose to the opposition leader, but he left. I wanted to ask him, are you if elected president of Guyana, will you pursue a notion or an idea of all agreement that has been made by this present government, seeing that the American State Department has stated that the government of Guyana was installed and not elected? Will you repeal all agreements made with any foreign government or companies? Thank you very much.
Good afternoon to the entire gathering. My name is Ron Lane and I hail from the wonderful village of Denham, still on the west coast of Demerara. Now I listened attentively to all that was said. And I would like to talk about the abuses that is being meted out to mainly African persons in this country. Now, as we know, they are trying to push us back onto the belly of the slave ships in which many of us came. They're trying to take away all that we have left of our dignity, and we will not allow that. And in this country, I don't know if because the installed president happens to be a Muslim, all the rights of females are being taken away from them. Because if we look at how the ministers of the installed ministers will treat the women in the other side of the political arena, insulting them in any way possible, and the installed president would say, oh, children are my mind, I'm looking after children, I have a love for women. And if the installed president could claim he has love for women and will allow one of his most disgraced minister to offer a woman a sexual tool, then it is now alleged that the same minister has caused that heinous crime against a little girl, and the installed president, who has love for women, has not seen it possible to allow the alleged minister to get the full quota for what he has done. In the same time when that installed minister was being called down for raping that girl, an African man was being given life imprisonment for raping a child. And I want to know if because the installed minister was a man with a lot of money that caused him to be free. Well, if that is it, that shows that the Muslim is raising up, because in a Muslim's life, a woman is only there to be a homemaker, a childbearer, and everything that is against the women. If you go to a Muslim affair, all the men sit to the front and the women are at the back. Because one time I went to something, we were all at the back. So when I get up, I said, suppose now, when you were sitting in front, somebody came and took away all the women from this gathering, what would you have said? They said, no, no, that's how it is. So in this country, with an installed government, we see that they have no love and respect for women. And once they could get money and pay a good lawyer, they will be sent away scot-free. Now, the last thing, that child who was talking there, he was jumping down to say, young people, but I'm quite certain if it was a Juve or a wet, violent, dirty party, he and the entire children of its age would have been there. But in something like this, where he could come and learn something, he is only here by chance because his father was not able to make an appearance, and the father asked him to come. So don't blame us. Don't listen for wet, violent Jube, skelly bums and them boys. Listen for things like this. Bye-bye.
Okay. All right.
Thank you very much, Head Table. My name is Noble Gavin Matthews Bay. I want to be direct. My question, My question lining comes from, I think most of the Head Table know Mr. Ivan Van Sturtimer and also Mr. Julius Malamus, but it's straight. Since the identity is based upon land, and it's to the Head Table, the identification of the person is based upon acquiring your ancestral lineage from whence you came. Since before the intervention of the British Corporation then in 1831, doesn't it give us the right to identify our heritage and our ancestral lineage from that particular aspect? Because we know of every other group who came after 1831, especially those who came in 1845. And the reason why I'm saying this, because everything is being taken away from us. So when it's being taken away from us, we hear the word ancestral lineage. So if we look at the laws, we look at prescriptive rights pertaining to the Constitution, especially the Lands and Surveys Act. Anything that you can claim after 30 years of occupation or after 12 years of occupation gives you the right to own a piece of land. And acquiration of land is based upon wealth. So if anybody, if any one of us who are here can claim our possession, our adverse possession to a piece of land based upon our ancestral lineage, well, then that gives us the right to the wealth of the now country we call Guyana. So this is a question to the Head Table. I know it's ticklish, but I want to hear your response. And as I say again, yes, this is a line out of the book of Mr. Van Sertima and Mr. Julius Malemus. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're gonna have the panelists respond.
Yes, good afternoon, brothers and sisters. Yeah, you don't have to look, see, no old, see my hair. I've been around these things for a long time. Following on what this young man said about land, I would like to ask a question. On April 22nd of this year, an order was published in the newspaper by the land registry, which listed 14 areas. And these are areas back of a number of East Coast villages. And this land was being acquired by the Central Housing and Planning Authority, most likely to distribute for housing. I have actually, it did say, of course, the usual thing, that if anybody has any objection and they give a time limit in which you should reply. I don't think that was done, but I made several copies of this notice, and I distributed it to all sorts of African leaders. A young man who was an attorney at law, very vibrant attorney at law, I showed him at a certain event I went to, and he said, okay, you're gonna do this. I said, no, this is not for old people do this, is young people work. You all have to go and lands and surveys and get copies of these plans and see how much land is being taken away, where is it? And it was land that is being held, was held under license. And I recall, I noticed a little bit about this land being held under license. I think it's from the Crown, when the Crown gave this land to these African people who were living in these villages. But nobody seems to be interested in these things. And making land registration is serious empowerment, because the minute your land gone, I mean, even if you can't do anything about it, at least you must know what's going on. That is how I look at things. I mean, I have been engaged in looking at land since I was 11. I was interested in it because of what happened in my life when I came to Georgetown from Puerto Rico. And my aunt used to tell me about how we lost most of our land that my great-grandfather, who died in 1885, who came from Guinea, West Africa, went to Leg One, and then among 4 African men bought the village of Puerto Rico. And she was always crying about this. So I got interested in land. And right now, only a quarter of it is left. And it is under siege. And as a matter of fact, a part of it, Mr. Dharamlal has last year has instructed that 30 acres of it, which the people before me, I mean, we Black people, we go service jobs, we don't stay on the land. So what they do is they lease it out to people to live. But Mr. Dharamlal has said, according to the law, it is not meant for residences. So we have to spend now at least upwards of $2 million to what you call it, regularize this. And I'm in the business of doing this now, right now. Some little brother say you can dead before this thing done, but I hope not. So I'm saying that we have to be more conscious about these things, about the importance of the ownership of land. Land is the basis of generational wealth, and we don't seem to be taking this on hand, really taking this into serious consideration.
I sense that most of what was said are not really questions, but propositions. So if I can comment on those that are with me. I would, in terms of In terms of the mobilization of young people, I would really like to benefit I would really like to benefit from the ideas that young people can share in terms of how we mobilize. It may be correct to say that old people don't know how to mobilize young people. That may be correct. But having said that, it means that young people have to advise us or themselves do the mobilization, or else we're not making sense. So I would think that the organizers are open to the ideas of young people as to how we can mobilize them for these activities. So that's one. I think one of the problems we face with is we come to these fora sometimes as individuals, sometimes as members of groups. But we don't go back to our community in whatever capacity having attended the forum. Because in my humble opinion, much of the work that can be done and has to be done at the level of the community or the level of interest groups. And if we just come to these forums, we don't go back to an interest group or go back to community to share, mobilize, and have action, then it reduces the worth of the forum. The forum here is not, this is not Coffee to 50 organization. This is Coffee to 50 facilitating an activity among people of African descent who can then go away from here back to their communities, action-oriented based on the ideas that have arisen here. And just let me give you one example. When Mr. Granger came in 2016 to Coffee 250, the same place, and he says, what are y'all doing about the decade? How did we get past that? We got past that because somebody went back to Coffee 250 and said, something got to happen. And somebody got to make it happen. And since the forum was a Coffee 250 forum, then Coffee 250 had an obligation to initiate what was going to happen. And something happened. So I'm just giving that as an example of the kind of spin-off effects that should really occur when you have a situation like this. On the land issue, a couple of comments. In Guyana, state lands are no longer subject to prescriptive rights. I think it's 2013, the law was changed, that you can't gain state lands by prescriptive rights. That's one. I think we ought to observe that the government did not or does not recognize that it has an obligation to protect individual property. And so it has left on the books prescriptive rights with private property, whilst in its own interests, it has taken off prescriptive rights for crown lands or state lands. And so these are things that people have to take up and make representation on. And probably, well, people have to take up and make representation because it clearly suggests a value system which says, look, nothing wrong if your ancestral lands are taken away by prescriptive rights, but something is wrong if state land are taken away. State land are really the people's lands. So what's the big thing about if the people get it through prescriptive rights? as opposed to private lands being taken away by prescriptive rights. I find that a contradiction in terms of how the government has approached the matter. Whatever, so as someone interested in the land issue, I recognize that we have a serious problem. That people come forward and say a lot about lands. But if you go to them to follow up, it's like a hole. You don't get the kind of information out of them that can help you to help them. I visited Irish Gibraltar about a month ago. They invited me to go land problems. And I said to them, all right, there seems to be a problem. But could you tell me definitively if there's a transport or transports for the land originally acquired by our ancestors? Couldn't get an answer to the question. But I'm being told that they got some lands over there and the government interfere with those lands and we got to take action. And I'm asking the question, are you unequivocal about the lands over there being ancestral lands? And no answer. And I have found that there are quite a few instances where people approach you on the question of what they call ancestral lands, because I have a different view on that matter as well. But when you try to help, they can't help you to help. I made a proposition to the COI on this question of ancestral lands. Of course, all things fell apart in terms of action coming out of the COI. I have another idea of a project that will try to go beyond individuals to see where we really are with these lands. I'm not going to comment on what that project is now because the commenting can change anything. But I do have a project which I would like us to pursue, and when I say us, it's Padaji, starting probably the pilot to deal with this question of ancestral lands, because it's really a quagmire right now. It's really a quagmire. But we know within that quagmire that lands that were purchased by our ancestors, we're being deprived of those lands. That is true, right? And in some instances, those lands were taken away by prescriptive rights. And the people to whom they should belong pay no attention to the lands themselves, and to other people's occupation. But what you get is when we come together, somebody raises the question, as if to say this forum got to solve the problem, when to a very large extent, we have to take responsibility for what has occurred in terms of lands being left abandoned, not being attended to. And the people who make the complaints sometimes are not even the ones with the land concern. The ones with land concern, just not there. For example, I was in Linden this morning, and a guy who was visiting from the States showed me a picture of 4 properties totally covered by bush that his grandparents owned, bequeathed to their children, and the property is just there, and everybody, the States and Trinidad, and they don't bother them. And sooner than later, somebody will probably take those properties by prescriptive rights. Right? There's no solution to that question at the communal level. The solution really, in the first instance, is at the individual level. So what our task really is raising consciousness so that people could take the kind of action required of them to protect their private property. But having said that, it doesn't mean I will not pursue the project at a holistic level to see if something could be done to protect, to determine which are those lands, and to go on to protect those lands. I think those are the questions that I can recall, and well, a question was addressed to somebody who could become president, and I don't know who that question was really addressed to. Is because I am not in the pipeline to be president. I don't know if Nigeria is. I don't know if anyone what was said.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make a general point. You see, African Guyanese people in many instances have walked off the land. We're no longer interested. All behavior is caused. And part of the cause of that behavior is how people were frustrated, grandly frustrated from developing their lands. In addition to that, the lack of knowledge of what happened on those occasions, specific occasions and when African people purchased lands immediately after the legal termination of physical enslavement. It wasn't emancipation. It was a step towards that. And many of those lands, especially in the back dams, have been lost because people were no longer interested in them. They got flooded out, pigs were shot, trees were cut down, lots of taxes imposed, blah, blah, blah. Occupation of those lands were made unattractive to our people. Many people walked out of those lands, and over time, relatives have lost the knowledge of what land exactly is theirs. Sometimes they know, but they're just not interested. I'm saying this in order to show how the general situation has been working against us. And the resurrection of African Guyanese will not take one action. It's a series of actions we need to take. It's a holistic approach to liberation. So just going on a land campaign is good, that we retain those lands. But many people are uninterested because they don't know. And they don't know because our history is not taught to us, either by our parents and grandparents, or by the formal education system, or by the informal education system, by which I mean radio, television, and so on. So we've got to understand our conditions, our situation, and recognize that there are a number of things we need to do to extricate ourselves from the current situation. One more thought on this is that the more things we do, and the more we do them, the easier the job is going to become. So, you know, it's a question of persisting, it's a question of recruiting other people through motivation, education, and whatsoever needs to be done to get us back together. I believe that the regeneration of villages is a strategic action that we need to achieve. Without the regeneration of villages, and this means, in my estimation, the retaking of village councils, the insistence on governing our own affairs, and sometimes we've got to be bold. We have to take radical action. And without this kind of thing, it's not going to happen, because we face a PPP administration that is determinedly racist, they're acting in a context that is loaded against us and in favor of them. How many of us are willing to stand up and take the necessary action? Why is that so? Rhetorical question. Why is that? Why is it that some of us are apathetic? We have to get the answers to these and make certain that we do the correct motivation. The gentleman who spoke in terms of young people being absent and so on has raised a perennial question very correctly, and our generation has got to respond appropriately in terms of social media and blah, blah, blah. So I think we know really what is to be done. The job is to go and do it.
Mr. Slow, you have any response? Mr. Slow?
Yes, Doc. No, I don't have any response.
You don't have any response?
No, I don't.
No. Okay, we'll take one more round of questions / comments, and then we'll wrap it up. I saw a couple of hands. Brother Royston is coming around.
Comrades, let me thank those who invited me to be here and congratulate those who made excellent presentations. I suggest that this group meet, and as an old Sowaki, I would request that I be present at that meeting to do the following things. One, a deep analysis of where the Afro-Guyanese are and the rest of the country generally. As though one of those who's been in the business for over 70 years, the Afro-Guyanese face the prospect of re-enslavement, and that's not an exaggerated statement. The ordinary people threat the prospect of a form of recolonization. A letter published in today's paper points to that position. I therefore suggest that this group meet, analyze the situation, and fix a timetable. September, to meet so many youth groups, including young men and women out of school. Fix a timetable so that by next Emancipation Month, we would have mobilized the intellectual vigor of our people, using the comrades on stage their vast information, and to say to this government is wicked. This government has inherited DNA of the slave master. Fix a timetable so that by next August, we have to be patient. We say to them, if we, and I hope I'm not being misunderstood, because I know they've sent some spy here today, that if we, who civilized the entire coast of this country, can't enjoy the fruits bestowed upon us by our Creator, gold, oil, diamonds, and timber, that nobody else will do so. They must understand that. We're not dealing with people who are easy. They don't mind if we have these forums once a month. Let them talk. For us, it will be business as usual. But we need to mobilize our young people, Afro and Indo, to expose the wickedness of this government. Parallel to that exercise, this group, you've got mighty people up there, should also analyze the attitudes of the Indian government, the Chinese government, the Russian government, the British government, and the American government. So that when we move, they will understand that we're serious people and that we need to go beyond talking. I met a group of pastors last week, because it is Sunday. And I said to them, they must now preach irrelevant theology. Yes, prayer, very useful. It satisfies the soul. But unless you take action, heaven help those who help themselves. And predicated on the discussions I am proposing, which should start this week, must be a non-negotiable of that fighting among ourselves. Because the enemy was learned well from the old slave master and the imperialists, are pursuing the old divide and rule policy with a growing number of house slaves. We need to identify them, name them, as I did, I think, at Kingley, when the Right Honorable Samuel, what's his middle name? Archibald Hines, set a group of descendants of manumitted Africans. We must forget the past. The Jews didn't do that. The Chinese didn't do that. But a black man serving the enemy, and those of you who were present at that emancipation day will remember Sam Hines said, we must forget our history. What he's saying to us, forget the past, be allowed by the new slave master to be slaves and be happy with the clothing and the perks from the slave master. Comrades, I repeat, let's meet, let's work out a strategy and make it, to use Burnham's term, lucidly clear. We're not satisfied with talk anymore. We need, as my friend Denny would say, an attitudinal metamorphosis, where we see in this country today a group similar to Charles I, who thought he enjoyed the divine right of kings and can ignore Parliament is now made a Mickey Mouse. You go to $61 billion for Gaisoko, and the money is going to one hand. My good young friend Nigel explained in detail what is happening in this country. Enough is enough. I take my seat, comrades. Let's meet this week. Fix a month-to-month program to get those young men and women excited about the revolution, so that by next August, we say to this government, this is what we want. We don't want any talk. establishing institutions. And them fellas study history, you know. And so that by next August, we should be in a position to move to the another round of the ladder. As Dr. Jagan himself said, the Afro-Guyanese are at the bottom of the ladder. We need to remind them that is not our place. That is not what our forefathers suffered, humiliation, degradation for. We need to get to the top of the ladder. They're not going to give us, we have to take it. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I have been asked to read 2 questions that came from the online audience. The first question is there any mechanism to mentor our youths utilizing resources in the diaspora? I know QC, Florida chapter, was supposed to have implemented such a scheme, but don't know about its success. If successful, this may serve as a template. The second question is, do we have a system in place whereby legal and other assistance can be readily provided to groups that are being attacked, whether disposed of land, etc., by the state or its proxies? This includes a fund to help defray the costs associated with these activities. The diaspora can possibly do this. Thank you.
We did not get a response about the request about those of our youngsters who are still struggling and not bothering about their next CXCs. The education issue was not responded to, please.
Thank you. Greetings in the name of Kadamawa Haile Selassie and Empress Menen. I am Waziro Esther Gittins. Leadership by example. I could recall, and a lot of us here could recall, there was once a lady who, when she received a legal document, she threw it over her shoulder, signifying that she had no respect for that paper and whatever is on it and the institution that it came from. In the same time of our reign, one of our Nyabingi tabernacles had been dismantled in the festival city. We tried several modes of getting the government to engage with us on the dismantling of our tabernacle, which were futile. So we decided, man, woman, and child, along with our drums, which we call our weapons, and we went in front of the town hall, who were responsible for that land, where our tabernacle was dismantled, and we engaged in a different sort of a protest that most persons are accustomed to. Though they were ignoring us, they were forced to meet with us. They begged us to cease our drumming and chanting, but we refused. We said we're not going to stop until you bring a resolution to our issue. So whilst most persons remain drumming and chanting, a few of our representatives, of which I was one, engage the relevant authorities until a path was identified to bring a solution to our problem. Again, I have a problem with recalling dates exactly, but when we had our first local government election after so many donkey years, 3 of our elder brethren, all 3 of them over 65, were arrested again at the Naebangi Tabernacle in Linden. We tried to engage the government through the normal routes to get their attention, to get a meeting with them concerning the brethren, because even though it wasn't legal, we had an agreement with the government that the police would not overrun our places of worship, and that was violated. Within a short time, we didn't even have to protest the whole day. Again, it was drums, chanting, men, women, and children. The whole family, we forgot about everything, and we went out there to demand or command respect for our requests. I have lost count of the letters from Itpadaji's chairman in the newspapers. I have lost count of his social medias, presentations on the issue. And as the youth said, it's all the same thing. I read every letter, hoping that at the end there is some call to action or something, but every time it's just the simple statement, well, this is what happening to we, this is being done, this is what they're doing, this is what they're going on, but yet still, we ain't really pointing the people in no direction or calling them for action. I mean, is the chairman writing on behalf of Itpadaji? But we are Itpadaji, all of us here. We're Itpadaji. Brother Vincent Alexander is only the chairman. How long or how many letters more and how many social media platforms will we have our chairman make and do before we decide to get up and tell the government, well, we don't do enough of that. Y'all gonna meet with me now. And we moving from here till y'all meet with me. We can't beg them no more. They ain't got no respect for letters. They ain't got no respect for talking. We talking too much. If Cuffy is still talking and writing, he writes so, and he had people write on his behalf. If Damon and others is still talking and writing, we would do that today, dragging chains. We gotta get up. By our actions, we telling these people, look, the banks, look at the way they're treating us. But by our actions, we telling them, well, we happy with this. We could live with this kind of thing. Look at what's going on with the oil, but yet still by our actions, we say we happy. We could live with it. And we could live with everything because we just sitting down and talking and writing. I listened today keenly to hear something new. I mean, I respect you, Brother Kimani Musi. I mean, you said the same thing many times using different words, different examples. The only new thing is the data. That's the only new thing. Well, I think we talk enough. We gotta decide how we gonna make these people do what they got to do for us. We got all the plan. We don't talk enough. We talk long. Talk's cheap. Actions speak louder than words. Thank you.
I know in the interest of time, quickly, I asked 2 questions. One was that, is it that this forum is recognizing that Irfan Ali as the duly elected president? That's why I have heard mentions made to him as His Excellency the President when there's a petition in the court questioning its legitimacy. That's one. Two, there's supposed to be a conference convened in the United States. I don't know, I could be wrong, but I saw it on the internet by Hakeem Jeffries dealing with the issue of Guyana. Will this forum or other African organization be a part of the forum, that forum, and raise the issue of the clean voters list, house registration, and biometrics? And if not so, the Guyana government refused to do that. Will they withhold the gas to shore project until such is achieved? Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we'll stop it there, unless somebody who has not spoken before has a burning question. No? Yes? No? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, good evening, daddies and mummies. Please permit me to honor you with the courtesy of being blunt. My name's Otiko Ikechukwu Nubisi. I'm from Nigeria, but I find a need to be this miss of my parents because my uncle from Uganda, India Main, said, anywhere you see a black man, whether in the moon or anywhere, that is your brother or your sister. So my question is, I've been in Guyana for 10 years and I've been studying what is happening in Guyana. I find out that my people, like my uncle said, are in the bottom ladder of economic aspect of this nation. But from my studies, I found out that the black people have the intellectual capital in this nation. And the black people also have the population. But I keep wondering, what is the problem? Is it division or is a spiritual problem? Because from the look of things, black people have what it takes in every aspect. So my question is, how can our people unite to get what belongs to them? Because from all indication, after Amerindians, it was black people, and it's black people who fought for the freedom of this nation. Then why are they suffering? I feel so devastated whenever I speak about it. But solution must be pursued in order to bring our people and let our people occupy their right position in this nation. I hereby submit my questions in a nutshell.
Okay. All right, we have the responses from the members of the panel.
Sorry, good afternoon. I can't remember your first question, but I'll answer the second one you asked about the gas to shore project. No conference held anywhere can set aside a contract entered into between the government and somebody else. That's just the way international business goes. We don't like it, we like it, that's the fact. One of the issues with contracts is that before we sign them, we need to be very, very familiar with what we're getting into. We need to have experts advise us, because once you have entered into them, you can't wake up the next morning and decide you don't like them and leave. The conference you're talking about in the US, where Mr. Jeffries is one of several persons, even if it passes the strongest resolutions with full unanimous support, it will have zero impact on any contract that is entered into. Contracts can only be set aside by one of two ways. The parties themselves decide to change the terms, or the courts, for some reason, strike it down. So I think we need to understand very clearly the environment in which we are and we are likely to be in. So I hope that addresses the issue that you raised in relation to the gas to shore. I don't know, I can't remember what your first question. Oh. Well, I can't speak for Coffee 250, so I will hand it either to Mr. Hines or Mr. Thing, but I'm sure they'll talk about de facto and
I suspect this is the final act of this, except for the chair. And I want to address our brother from Nigeria. I didn't hear your name, but I think you raised a question that has been raised in many ways today. The answer to why people do not act in their own interests is because they don't know that that's their interest. And the reason why they don't know that that's their interest is because they don't know who they are. This is a question of identity. And what I meant when I said that in order to repair our situation, we have to do several things simultaneously, preferably, and keep doing them until the ball starts to roll downhill. That's one of the things I mean. African Guyanese will not respond as you and I want them to respond or want us to respond in large numbers because we don't know who we are. We're a confused people. You ask us who we are, somebody say, I'm a Christian. What does that mean? Does Christianity teach us about our past? Does it teach us to respect our culture, to know our culture? These are questions that we have to ask ourselves. And if we can't get the right answers, we're going to keep coming back to forums like these in the same situation. Here are questions for us. How many of us belong to organizations? This is what identity does. Are we going to return from this forum to talk to our friends, our family, our neighbor about what went on here, to get them involved? Do we have campaigns to get people close to us, whether it's friends or neighbors, more and more people plugged into organizations like these? These are the real questions because they're action questions. And when we say, let's do actions, we mean some of these things. We have to keep at it all the time.
They would not send special branch here this afternoon if they thought we were playing around here. They know we are not playing around. I am not saying this to say that I don't recognize the frustrations. Yes, and we must be frustrated. But even in the process of being frustrated, we are moving the struggle forward. As I like to say, we are winning. We are winning. We are winning. And at some point, we will recognize the fruits of what we are doing here. We came here as free people, free in spirit, free in mind. We leave with that freedom to go back to where we come from, go back to our communities, go back and turn that freedom of spirit, that spiritual freedom, to turn that into actual freedom, free our young people from the shackles of distance. Because it is not that our young people are not involved. I have taken a lot of time recently to talk to young people wherever I go. And the fact that young people recognize me and say politics 101, they will listen. Don't believe that they don't know what's going on. It is for us to continue to do more of this. Thousands of them are listening as we speak, and they're taking notice. We just have to continue to press on. The other side is continuing to press on. And after today, they will have to adjust what they are doing. They will not tell us they've adjusted, but they will have to adjust because we are on the move. Let us move forward. Let us not lose spirit. Old people say, thank you very much. Yeah. Yes. How much? Yes. You said money? You said you buy some drinks on it. Well, welcome to Boston. I don't think it's strong. Let me see what these guys are doing. Oh, you with some people? No. I just go about it today. But I I'm my brother. Right. All right.